All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the webinar Russia, Ukraine, and the United States by the Honorable William Taylor, former ambassador of the United States to Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Tarabara. I'm a professor at Michigan State University and the director of MSU's Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. Our center emphasizes the need to explore linkages with international institutions and study emerging challenges across Europe and Eurasia. The entire world is now facing an ominous challenge with the epicenter in the middle of Europe, in Ukraine, and with Ukrainian people fighting for their lives and for all of us. And what historian Yaroslav Hrytsak, in his article yesterday, said can now be truly called patriotic war, which is Nyana Vina in Ukrainian. The webinar is organized by the MSU Ukrainian Student Association at Michigan State University with our center's help. I'm passing the baton now to the organization's president, Yuri Tomkiev, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Trimаємо стрій. We keep our line of defense. We stand in solidarity and prayer for people of Ukraine. Yuri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Tarabara. Hello, everyone. My name is Yuri Tomkiev. I'm the president and founder of the MSU Ukrainian Students Organization, and I want to begin by thanking you all for being here today with us. Ukraine's ongoing struggle with Russia has taken a toll on many lives, and your being here to listen shows us your support for the Ukrainian cause and your willingness to learn more about the true nature of the conflict. I would now like to introduce our esteemed presenter, Ambassador William B. Taylor. Ambassador Taylor is a graduate of West Point and Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and served as an infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in Vietnam and Germany. In addition to his extensive public service, Ambassador Taylor served as a U.S. ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. In 2019, he served as the Charge d'Affaires in the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, and currently is Vice President, Russia and Europe at the United States Institute of Peace. After Ambassador Taylor completes his presentation, there will be time for questions, so please type any questions you have into the Q&A option below once the presentation has concluded. Ambassador Taylor, I now turn this over to you to provide to us your insights about the current situation in Ukraine.
Yuri, thank you very much. And Professor Tarabara, thank you very much for being here as well. And thank you to the groups. I see Mr. Graham is there as well. And I look forward to having conversations with Matt. Yuri, as your flag behind you reminds me, as I was driving into work this morning, on every overpass between here and Washington, D.C., I live out in Virginia, in Arlington, and I'm driving in on every overpass, there were those flags and the American flag side by side. This conflict that you have just described, referenced, that we're going to be talking about here today has garnered the interest and attention of people around the world, not just those driving in but around the world. This is, and so there we are. Professor Graham, he's got the flags as well. That's exactly what was on the overpasses. Those flags also appear all over Ukraine. The support for the Ukrainian nation among Ukrainians has never been higher. I've never seen it. I was in Ukraine a month ago. Had an opportunity to talk to a lot of Ukrainians, a lot of my good friends there that I stay closely in touch with. I also talked with President Zelensky, and the intensity of the resistance that Ukrainians feel to this invasion is you can feel it. You can feel it, and it is all over the world, and people all over the world are supporting Ukrainians at this point. So what I will do, if this works for you, is to just run through kind of the situation with as it stands now in Ukraine, from what I see going on in Russia, and then kind of the U.S. and allied response. Maybe a little bit about where we go from here, what we can expect, I look forward then to the conversation with Matt Pauley, Professor Pauley, and with any and everyone who has these questions that we can discuss. Comments are fine as far as I'm concerned. I learn from everyone who asks a question or makes a comment, and I would like to continue that today. So I'm sure I don't have to describe the background of this. The Russians, of course, invaded Ukraine in 2014 when they invaded Crimea, the southernmost part of Ukraine and on the Black Sea. They then invaded what we call Donbass, parts of two oblasts in the eastern part of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, and have been there ever since. They've attempted to annex Crimea with a fake referendum, and they maintain their troops there to this day. And as we know, they have now invaded again. They invaded in February. They are challenging the Ukrainian military. Ukrainian military is, here it is in what, the 8th day of this fight. The world expected, and I am very sure the Russians expected, that this would not take so long. They expected, I'm sure the Russians expected to be in Kiev after 2 days, after a day and a half. And the Ukrainian military has put up such a fight around the country. And we can talk about this. That is totally unexpected by the Russians. The Russians haven't covered themselves with glory by any means. They have been pretty incompetent, surprisingly, in particular on the northern front. But nonetheless, the Russians have the capabilities, have the resources. They outnumber the Ukrainian military overwhelmingly. This is David and Goliath, and it's 10 to 1 just on the spending. So it's enormous odds that the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian military face in this challenge. The Ukrainian nation, as I said, has rallied like I'm sure no one in Russia was expecting. The Ukrainian nation has pulled together behind their president. Some might have thought this was an unlikely hero. Some might have thought that President Zelensky, who has only had 2 years, he's only been in office 2 years, and before this 2 years, he had not held an elective office, had no government experience. And he has stepped up and he has rallied the nation behind him. I mentioned that I've got good friends in Ukraine still, and I talked to them when I was there a month ago. And I talked to them over the last couple of days. One good friend took his family out to the western part of Ukraine, dropped them off with his father, turned around, drove back, joined the Territorial Defense Forces, and was defending his community when the Russians invaded and were approaching and are approaching Kyiv. He joined the military, the active duty, the regular forces. At that time, he had to turn in his cell phone. So I've not heard from him for 2 days. I've heard through his wife, however, that he's doing fine. That's one example of millions of Ukrainians who are defending their home, defending their land, defending their independence, defending their sovereignty and their freedom. And they are rallying behind this President Zelensky, who, again, many people were not sure that this man was up for the job. He's clearly up for the job. He has stepped up. He has stepped up into the moment. On the Russia side, what motivated? What could we possibly think would motivate this guy? Would be the reason that President Putin would invade Ukraine? We can talk about this. I'm sure there are people on this call who have ideas and thoughts and theories about why. There's no good reason. First of all, let's just be clear. There's no reason. It was totally unprovoked. Ukraine poses no threat to Russia. President Putin has a hard time, had a hard time defending, rationalizing, trying to find a justification that he could give in the first instance to the Russian people of why he was going to invade a neighbor, a friendly neighbor. As people on this call know, there are family ties, business ties, historical ties between these two nations. The Ukrainians, of course, are very clear that they are a distinct, proud nation, separate from, but obviously related to and having had a lot of interaction with the Russians over the centuries. The Russians, in particular, President Putin, I think doesn't understand Ukraine. He may think that he understands an older version of Ukraine. Matt Polly was in Ukraine in 2001, 2002. I was in Ukraine 2006, 2009. In those times, there was an active debate, a vigorous debate. Ukraine's a raucous democracy. It has contested elections every time. And every time there's been a presidential election, the Ukrainian people have gone the other way. That is, they elected a president from the East. The next election, they elected somebody from the West, and then back to the East and back to the West. They've done this 6 times. This is a real democracy. And during that time, between up until 2013, 2014, there were Ukrainians who thought that Russia might have a good model. There were Ukrainians, probably more Ukrainians, that thought the Europeans had a good model and wanted to go in that direction. But there was a debate. There was a debate about NATO, whether or not to join NATO. There was a debate about language, about the status of the Russian language. Everybody understood that the Ukrainian language was the state language, but what about the Russian language? What about the Hungarian language? There was all kinds of real debates and found solid debates. That is, people really believed this stuff and elections. They were political parties that reflected these. And that may be the Ukraine that President Putin has in mind. And if so, he's mistaken, because that Ukraine doesn't exist any longer. That Ukraine came to a major change in 2014 and is further consolidated, crystallized today in 2022 with latest invasion. And today's Ukraine, and ever since 2014, when the Russians invaded the first time into Crimea and Donbass, the Ukrainian people have seen the Russians not as brothers, but now as enemies. And the hatred for President Putin and the hatred for the Russian government now it's palpable. You can feel it. It is visceral. And if President Putin thought that he could drive on down to Kyiv in a day, or if he thought that he would be received as a liberator or well received in the eastern part of Ukraine, where a lot of people speak Russian as well as Ukrainian, or in the southern part of Ukraine, where a lot of people speak Russian as well as Ukrainian, he's wrong. He is dead wrong. This is a new Ukraine, Mr. Putin. This Ukraine is not eager at all. It will never accept being under your thumb any longer. And he may not understand that. He's got some big problems on his hand, Mr. Putin. As I say, the people of Russia, in my view, my understanding, from what I get, people of Russia do not support this invasion. The people of Russia are going to, in my estimate, reflect this disagreement with the decision of President Putin to invade, and it's going to become harsh disagreement when these Russian soldiers who are being killed in Ukraine, some of these Russian soldiers being killed in Ukraine, are not even aware of where they're being sent. They were not told why they were going anywhere. They were talking maybe as an exercise. And when these soldiers return back to their villages and towns in Russia for burial, those families are going to ask their government and their president why. And the president doesn't have an answer. This anger is going to be exacerbated, it's already begun to be exacerbated by the sanctions, the economic sanctions that the West has unified to put on the Russian economy to make it more difficult for them to pursue this invasion. And frankly, to punish President Putin for his decision. Sadly, these sanctions will affect every Russian family, and they will bear the costs of their government's decision, their president's decision. And that is a problem, that anger on the part of the Russian people toward their president, that's a problem for Mr. Putin. The response to this invasion from the United States and from NATO allies, from the European Union, from allies and partners around the world has been dramatic, I mean, the American effort, General Doug Lute, who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, he knows about surges. And he yesterday was talking to people and he said this diplomatic surge over the past 3 months is unlike anything he's ever seen. I totally agree. That is the effort that the Biden administration, let's give him credit, the Biden administration has made to rally NATO, to rally the European Union, to rally the G7, to rally the East Asian allies. It hadn't stopped there. They're calling the Saudis, they're calling the Qataris, they're calling everyone around the world. They're calling every government to ensure support for Ukraine and ensure condemnation for the Russians. This has been an incredible outpouring of support for Ukraine. Just 2 days ago, and then yesterday, the UN took 2 votes. First in the Security Council, UN Security Council, where there was overwhelming support for a resolution that would condemn Russia for this invasion. There was only 1 vote against it, and that was Russia. And unfortunately, they have a veto in the Security Council. So that resolution did not pass. But interestingly enough, in addition to all of our allies that voted for that resolution, there were a couple of abstentions. And an interesting abstention was the Chinese. The Chinese abstained. They did not support Russia. Yesterday, in the General Assembly, where Russians don't have a veto, there was another vote by all of the General Assembly. And there, the vote was 141-5 to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This was the result of this diplomatic surge, this effort to build support for Ukraine, led by the United States, but participated in by European heads of state, by European leaders, by Ukrainians, by President Zelensky has been part of that effort around the world. 141 nations voted in the General Assembly to condemn Russia. Russia got 4 other votes. One of them was Belarus, a co-defendant in this measure. The Belarusians are fighting Ukrainians with the Russians, and so they voted with the Russians. The North Koreans voted with the Russians. The Syrians voted with the Russians. So this is a small group, a small, sad group that voted to support the Russians in this invasion of Ukraine. My point here is the world, the international community, all the nations have in that 141 have banded together to condemn this invasion, and that has also resulted in these harsh sanctions that I've already mentioned. Those are international, they're not just American sanctions, they are international sanctions, in particular with the Europeans, but others as well, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians, all of the Europeans. So this is a worldwide show of support for Ukraine and condemnation and punishment for the Russians. Where do we go from here? So I'm going to wrap up here shortly, Matt, and turn it over to you for your questions and questions from people tuned in here. But where do we go from here? My sense is the Ukrainian people will continue to fight. They will continue to resist, no matter what happens on the battlefield. And I don't know what's going to happen on the battlefield. As I've said, the Ukrainian military has fought ferociously, fiercely, and successfully in many occasions. They have inflicted horrible losses on the Russians. The Russians have stalled out in several of their attempts to take Kyiv. The Russians have made some progress in the south, there's no doubt. They've made some progress in Kharkiv in the east, no doubt. But the Russians have not performed, the Russian military has not performed well, and the Ukrainian military has performed well, and Ukrainian people will continue that resistance no matter what happens. President Zelensky has stepped up, as I mentioned, to lead his nation and to lead the international community for that matter. He is now an international hero for what he has done. And he will continue to lead Ukraine, and they will continue to follow him, the Ukrainians and the military. I mentioned my friend who's in the military. He says the military is proud to be serving under Vladimir Zelensky. They're proud. He will continue. At some point, he may have to leave Kyiv. He has been reluctant to leave the capital of Kyiv. He wants to stay there and demonstrate that they are defending their capital. They're defending their land. And he wants to stay there as long as possible. He may at some point, though, have to go to southwestern part of Ukraine. There are mountains. There are lovely mountains there. The Carpathians are, and there are places that he can continue to be and lead the nation, be the leader and lead the nation as president and as the legitimate government. He will continue to lead the resistance. That resistance will be the military that continues, as well as enormous numbers of Ukrainians who are taking up arms right now, ready to defend their villages, their homes, their towns, their forests, their roads. If the Russians try to occupy Ukraine, over time, they will be driven out. This is my belief, that the Ukrainians will fight. They will make it hell for the occupiers. They will kill a lot of occupiers. And the Russians know about this. The Russians tried this in Afghanistan years ago, and the Afghans eventually drove them out. And the Ukrainian nation is much stronger than the Afghan nation. It's much stronger. Ukrainians have a real nation, have a real consolidated democracy and nation, and they will expel the Russian occupiers. I am sure. I am sure. We will look back on this. We will learn some lessons from this this episode. But Ukraine will come out of this, I am sure. NATO will come out. You know, President Putin has rejuvenated this North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, has rejuvenated NATO from a time not long ago when people were wondering, well, what's it really for? And now we know what it's for. We know what it's for. Again, we know what NATO is there to do. It's to defend its members against an aggressive Russia. Turns out that there are some nations who are now noticing how aggressive Russia is. Finland, Sweden might want to join. These nations might want to join NATO. They're thinking about it. Why? Because the Russians threatened them. So NATO has been rejuvenated. The European Union has stood up. There are nations who have been neutral all along. Switzerland. You always thought about putting your money in Switzerland because it was nonpartisan, neutral. The Swiss are on the side of the Ukrainians and of the Europeans against the Russians. This is a major change that we will be looking back on and talking about and seeing the implications of for years to come. And I will say that at some point soon, Ukraine will be a member of the European Union, I believe. And at some point, I will bet that Ukraine will be a member of NATO. They will be a successful democracy. They'll be a prosperous member of the European Union. That's all they want. Ukrainians just want to be able to live a normal life as a normal European country in security. And we owe them support for that. So Matt, let me turn it over to you, and thank you for monitoring all this and reading out the questions and asking your questions, and again, thank you for having me here.
You bet. Yuri was going to invite questions as well. Again, right, Yuri?
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Ambassador Taylor, for that very interesting presentation. So yeah, as the ambassador and Professor Pauly said, we will now be accepting questions below in that Q&A tab on your screens, where all questions will be read and presented by our moderator. Our moderator today, as you have seen, is Dr. Matthew Pauly. Dr. Pauly is an associate professor in the MSU Department of History and a core faculty member in the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, and an expert on Ukraine. Dr. Pauly.
Very good. Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you for that inspiring talk. It makes me optimistic, and I'm grateful for that in these very difficult times. And if Ukrainians are listening now, I hope they'll take heart as well. So most of my questions regard U.S. policy towards Ukraine, but we have some questions that have appeared in the Q&A that address concerns particular to the ongoing war, and obviously events are changing quickly. So we're doing our best to keep on top of all these, and I appreciate the questions that have been posed. So I took the liberty of writing some formal questions because we have a relatively short amount of time together. And I thought I'd address one concern you raised in your talk. That is, you said that Russia had no reason to invade Ukraine, and yet people seem to constantly offer explanations as to why that occurred. And one explanation that has had some traction that I think you're particularly in an advantageous position to respond to is this question about NATO expansion, right? So there've been claims made by some scholars and pundits that the West, that is the transatlantic community is partly responsible for Russia's actions in Ukraine because it pursued the eastward expansion of NATO. In 1999, Ukraine's neighbor to the west, Poland, became a NATO member. And in 2004, its neighbor to the southwest, Romania, as well as 3 former Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Estonia, became NATO members. And in the view of these critics, President Putin is acting out of concern for Russia's security interests because Russia is under threat. So I'd like to invite your response to that particular critique.
Thank you, Matt. And this, you're absolutely right to ask this question. And it is out there. You will not be surprised to hear that I disagree totally with that analysis, but it merits a conversation. It merits a debate, and there is a debate. And I would say 2 things. There are a lot more that we could go through. But number one, NATO is no threat to Russia. NATO is not a threat to Russia. NATO is and always has been and always will be a defensive alliance. It is there for the defense, as I mentioned right at the end there. It's there for the defense of its members. Defense of its members. It's not there to attack anyone. Certainly not Russia. It's there for defense. I bet that there are no Russians who worry about an attack from NATO. I bet there are no Russians that worry about an attack from Latvia or from Poland or from Romania or from the United States for that matter. There's no evidence, no indication there's any threat to the Russians from NATO. So that's number one. My second point, and we can, there may be more questions that you want to follow up on this, Matt, but my second point is about NATO expansion. When the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, the wall fell in 1989, the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, and these new independent states emerged from the ashes, if you will, of the Soviet Union in 1992 and on, 30 years ago. All of a sudden, after the Berlin Wall fell, and all of a sudden, after the Soviet Union imploded, disappeared, all of a sudden, these East European countries were free. They were free. They were independent. They were no longer controlled by the Soviet Union or Russia. And they worried about their security. They worried about Russia trying to regain control over them. And they looked around and they noticed that some nations close to them were secure in their own borders because they were in NATO. They were in a collective defense alliance. And they applied. NATO didn't go seeking new members. The United States certainly didn't go try to strong arm the Poles and the Czechoslovaks as they were then, or the Bulgarians or the Romanians. No, these countries applied to NATO because they were worried about the Russian intent against them. And they knew, these applicants knew that they had work to do. They had to be democracies. They had to reform their militaries so that the militaries in Poland would be compatible with the rest of NATO. And there was work to be done, and they did it. They were also applying at the same time for membership to the European Union because of the economic benefits and political benefits of being part of Europe. They never ceased thinking of themselves as European, even while they were under the thumb of the Soviet Union in the Warsaw Pact or part of the Soviet Union. They never gave up on their Europeanness. And so they were interested in joining the EU, the European Union, as well as NATO. And the EU put them through some strict reform measures. They complied. NATO put them through some strict reform measures. They complied. And both organizations, the European Union and NATO, said yes and admitted new nations. So this canard, in my view, that NATO is a threat, and this canard that NATO tried to move the boundaries, was tried to encroach on Russian interests. No, I reject that. Now, my rejection will not stop the debate. Matt knows. There are people who will continue to argue this, and I will continue to oppose. But that's where I am.
Very good. Thank you for that very strong and comprehensive response. So I'm going to ask another question that aligns with several questions that are being posed in Q&A, just so everybody out there understands we're ending at 5:30. So we're trying to be rather economical in the way that we pose these questions. And so I apologize if I don't get to everybody's questions, but
that's a way for Matt to tell me that I should be short on my answer.
No.
I got it, Matt.
I love hearing your wisdom. So, and the more extended and learned the response, I think we're all better for it. But there's this question, obviously, about war crimes. So President Zelensky has asked the International Criminal Court, the ICC, to prosecute Russia for illegal attacks on civilians, particularly this devastating attack on the center of Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine. And the ICC has launched a probe into Ukraine's claims. But the United States is, of course, not party to the ICC. So what role does the United States have in ensuring that Russia is held accountable for any war crimes that it has committed in this war? And how can the US assist Ukraine in its demands for justice?
First of all, I agree with President Zelensky and disagree actually with President Biden, who has said that he's not yet sure, that it hasn't been investigated enough. My view is war crimes have been committed, that President Putin is a war criminal. And I say that because of the attacks on civilians, on unarmed civilians, intentional attacks. I mean, we're not talking about accidental attacks. We're talking about intentional attacks, as Matt just said, on downtown Kharkiv, on schools and hospitals. These are war crimes. There are illegal there are weapons that are banned that the Russians are using against Ukraine. They are clearly violating international law. They are clearly violating the UN Charter. There's no self-defense argument here. This is unprovoked, unjustified attack, and with disproportionate effect on innocent people, intentionally inflicted. That's to be a war crime.
So what does the US do then if it's not party to the ICC?
It builds support. It
Yeah.
builds support, Matt. You're right. I mean, we haven't signed on to the Rome Treaty, but we can certainly do this diplomatic surge that I talked about that has resulted in 141-5 vote in the General Assembly and 11-1 in the Security Council, and these overwhelming sanctions. We can continue that kind of support for war crimes investigations. Even though we're not party to it, we can certainly support it.
All right, very good. So one last question for me, and then I'll turn to the questions that are being posted in the Q&A. And I thank you for posting them. We will make a record of these questions, and we're very happy to provide it to the ambassador should he be interested in reading some of the commentary. There's comments as well as questions that are appearing, and some quite insightful ones that really demonstrate an appreciation of what is at hand. So the United States ambassador to the United Nations has said that the American armed forces will not enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine, despite the pleas of the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people. However, the US and multiple countries, both NATO countries and, interestingly, non-NATO countries, have pledged the delivery of arms to Ukraine. Some of these have arrived, others have not. And my question really relates to then the dynamic battlefield, right? Russia is now in control of one major Ukrainian city, Kherson. It's threatening Mariupol. It's frankly threatening the whole northern coast of the Black Sea. It seems to be preparing to place siege in Kharkiv, under siege. And so what sort of logistical problems do you imagine coming forward in regards to the delivery of these missiles? It's immensely, I think, hardening probably to the Ukrainian armed forces that they've had these sorts of promises, and yet it will be increasingly difficult to deliver these arms to a formal Ukrainian army if the situation continues to move in the direction that is at the advantage of the Russians, or where the Russians occupy more and more Ukrainian land.
Good question, Matt. Good question. On the first part of your statement about the no-fly zone, this is an active debate. I hear this every day from Ukrainians. Please just take the sky back. Protect us from the Russian Air Force. And the Ukrainians, when they're asking for this, they remember and they point out that we've done this before. We did this in Iraq, where we enforced a no-fly zone over Kurdistan. So it can be done. Here's the problem, and here's the issue, and then we get to the supply question that you raised as well, Matt. But the problem with the no-fly zone is we would be committing, if we were to agree to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine, so that the Russians couldn't fly their aircraft and couldn't defend themselves and defend their convoys with the Russian aircraft. If we were to try to enforce that, enforcement means shooting down Russian airplanes who violate the no-fly zone. The United States shooting down Russian airplanes means that we will be quickly at war with Russia. President Biden has been very clear that he doesn't intend to put US troops on the ground for the same fear, that if US troops are on the ground in Ukraine, in proximity as they will be to Russian military troops, that is too much of a risk, President Biden has said, of triggering, sparking, igniting a war between the United States and Russia, between NATO and Russia, which could spin out of control in horrible ways. So that is the argument. In my view, it's a good argument. I've had this conversation, this argument, this discussion. I've heard the requests from my Ukrainian friends, both in and out of the Ukrainian government, and I am heartbroken. I wish we could do that. Now, there are some things that we can do in this vein, in this domain, if you will. The Russians have been using electronic interference, electronic jamming, to degrade the ability of the Ukrainian Air Force to attack convoys, this famous convoy to the north of Kyiv. The Russians, of course, are trying to defend that airspace to keep Ukrainian Air Force from attacking that convoy, which they, I'm sure, would love to do. Those are sitting ducks. If there weren't aircraft, Russian aircraft, defending the skies over top of that convoy. The Russians are jamming the Ukrainians' Air Force so that they have a hard time coordinating, getting messages, coordinating in attacks. And what we could do, we have the ability, the United States and NATO, we have the ability to counter that jamming, that Russian jamming. We could do that. That's not a no-fly zone. It's not what the Ukrainians want, but that we could do. We could also, then this gets the next thing that we can do, Matt, gets into your question about how we provide the weapons, the missiles, the ammunition, the supplies, the communications equipment, the trucks, all of the things that the Ukrainian military has, but is using and is using up and needs more. And we used to be able to, we've all seen the video, on TV. We've seen in November and December, these big airplanes, US airplanes flying into Kyiv, Boryspil Airport that Matt knows well, and then unloading these Javelin missiles and these ammunition for the artillery, big pallets that's going on. We can't use that airport anymore. That airport has been destroyed by the Russians and their attacks, and the other airports around Kyiv, same way. Other ports around the country, same way. So we can't resupply by air any longer. Now we have to resupply by truck over the roads. Now here, the Ukrainians are at an advantage. The Ukrainians are fighting for their country. They know their country. They know their roads. The Russians may have maps, although it's great to see. We've all seen, I'm sure, the Ukrainians who have changed all the road signs to try to confuse, and probably succeeded in confusing the Russians. Not only did they change the road signs, say pointing in the wrong direction, they had some very blunt messages, very rude messages for the Russians when they looked at those road signs. The Russians saw these big road signs that basically told them, go back to Russia. In more flowery words. The Ukrainians know their roads, and the Ukrainians know the main highways. The Russians can figure out the main highways, but the Ukrainians know the side roads. The Ukrainians know how to get over this river when the bridge is destroyed. Maybe that bridge may have been destroyed by Ukrainians to keep the Russians from coming down that main road. But the Ukrainians know how to get around that. They know their country. They know their woods. They know their trails. They know the small roads that go in and out of Ukraine across these borders, and they're using them. I heard this morning that there's fresh vegetables in Kyiv. that tells me that there is a flow of goods. There is a flow into Ukraine. And if they can get fresh vegetables in there, they can get ammunition in there.
Very good. Thank you so much. So we'll turn to some questions from the audience and move away from my formal questions here, but I hope I've overlapped with some of your concerns reading through some of the comments that have been posed. I'd suggest that there was certainly a common concern, particularly regarding war crimes and regarding this issue of the no-fly zone. This is what I hear from my Ukrainian friends as well. They're constantly asking, of course, for air cover, and of course, sending me pictures of the heinous war crimes that seem to have been committed by the Russian armed forces. So if there are Ukrainians listening, I hope I've done some justice to your concerns, even if you may be less than satisfied with the official US response. So there's a very good question about Chernobyl. That is Russian control over Chernobyl, and I suppose this issue also of President Putin putting his own nuclear arsenal on alert. So how would you address generally the question of nuclear security, both as it I suppose applies to nuclear weapons, but also, of course, the danger of radiation again leaking out of Chernobyl and presenting a threat to the rest of Europe, indeed, perhaps even beyond?
So two separate questions, both related to nuclear. You're exactly right, Matt. On Chernobyl, as we know, Chernobyl is on the avenue of approach, as the military would say, from Belarus to Kyiv. And the Russians are using that avenue approach as they try to get enough forces down to Kyiv to encircle it or to invade it, to try to go into Kyiv, whatever their plans are. Don't really know what that is, but they have to go by Chernobyl. So they apparently, I'm prepared to believe that they now have control of the Chernobyl complex. Matt's been there, I'm sure. I've been there a bunch of times. When I have people visited me, my family and friends who visited, we always went up there. That facility is now well contained. There's no danger, short of military action or short of some kind of stray bomb or other aircraft crashing. That's well controlled at this point. The international community did a good job of funding that containment. So barring some kind of accident, presumably unintended by the Russians, I'm not so worried about that facility. There are concerns that the tanks and artillery and other trucks that go through the area could stir up radiation from the ground, and that's a concern, should be monitored. The bigger question is the second one you asked, Matt, and that is this irresponsible. It's just irresponsible for President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov to be talking about nuclear weapons. In my view, that kind of talk, first of all, it's irresponsible. But second of all, it is more for demonstration or intimidation effect. I don't believe that the Russians intend to use nuclear weapons at all, not in Ukraine, not against NATO. I don't believe that they are. Now, there have been people smarter than I am, a lot of people smarter than I am, who know President Putin better than I do. I don't know him well at all, but people have studied him. And there are people who have seen him up close. Condi Rice, the former Secretary of State, has said she thinks he's unhinged. Mike McFaul, former ambassador to Russia, has concerns about the same thing, about whether he's in full control of his mental processes. So that's troubling. President Macron has said that this the President Putin that he visited recently is not the same man as visited him earlier. So one has to be concerned about that. If this is a madman, then with access to nuclear weapons, this is a concern. The other argument, which I find more persuasive actually, is he's not mad. He's not crazy. He has a different calculation of costs and benefits. I would have thought and did think that he would not invade because the costs of invasion would be so high. The price he would pay would be so high in terms of lives lost, in terms of threats to his regime from angry Russians, in terms of the sanctions that would hammer the Russian economy, not just now, but into the future, that those costs are so high that it was inconceivable to me that he would actually pay those costs to invade. And yet he did. And yet he did. And the argument on this side, on the rational actor, not irrational actor, which is the first body of thinking, the rational actor is he's rational in his own way. He has a different calculation of what the benefits and costs are. And he decided that the benefits of being a great Russian leader or ensuring that Ukraine was never going to join NATO when it wasn't going to join NATO anytime soon anyway, but for whatever reasons, he decided to invade. But he's not crazy. And in that line of thinking, he's not suicidal. It would be suicide for him to initiate, as Lavrov has suggested, a nuclear war. It would be irrational in the extreme for him to use a nuclear weapon against a much smaller military like Ukraine. It would make no sense from a military standpoint, from a political standpoint. It would make sense. So while we have to be concerned, because Condi Rice might be right, he could be unhinged, but we have to be prepared. We could also have some comfort that he's not going to commit suicide. However, we need to be prepared. We need to be careful about this. We need to take precautions. And the United States government, Jen Psaki, on behalf of the president, said that they have reviewed their nuclear posture and their defense against any nuclear attack, the posture that we're in, and they are comfortable with the current status. They've done the right analysis, and they are prepared for anything, but they don't think they need to increase the nuclear alert status. So that's my sense, Matt.
Very good. Some questions maybe posed by U.S. Servicemen and women, which I think are quite interesting. I have a few students who are training to become officers. They've been asking me a lot of questions about the possible widening of this war to other NATO member states. And I suppose one question then is, do you see that as a possibility? And then related to that, is the question motivated by your discussion of the sort of ignorance of the Russian soldiers' mission, right, on the part of the average Ivan? How should an American soldier be educated about their mission, right? What would you tell a American young man or young woman headed out to a position in Poland or somewhere else along the border with Ukraine? What would you say to them about why that mission is important?
So on their first question, about the possibility of the Russians making a bad mistake and starting a war, starting an aggression against a NATO member, that would be a horrible mistake. And if Russia is allowed to take Ukraine, that mistake, that decision, that possibility of Russians going further beyond Ukraine into Poland, or into the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, or into Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, all would be on the border of the Russian military if Ukraine is allowed to fall. he won't stop. Putin will not stop with Ukraine if he's allowed to keep going. He will stop when he's stopped. And the Ukrainians right now are stopping him. They're trying. It's a valiant effort. Again, it's David and Goliath. But that Goliath, might proceed to Kyiv and might proceed to Odessa. That Goliath may well have some military success temporarily, because in the end, as I've said earlier, I think the Ukrainians will push them out. The Ukrainian will push them out, and that will stop him. But if he's not stopped, if we don't support the Ukrainians and allow them to push back on the Russians, then he will keep going, whether it's right away or whether it's sometime later, years from now. He will keep going, and they will be under threat. So that's why it's so important that Ukraine be free and independent and sovereign, and part of a international system that respects sovereignty and respects boundaries and borders. So that's on the first part. On your second question about young soldiers and young lieutenants, talking to young soldiers about what they're doing, why they are being sent to Poland. So Matt, when I was my first unit when I was in the Army was the 82nd Airborne, and the elements of the 82nd Airborne out of Fort Bragg are now in Poland, already in Poland, and they're deploying. And there are conversations like you just described in the 82nd and in other units about why the United States and the 82nd Airborne and their battalion and their company and their platoon and their squad and those individual soldiers, why they're there. And we do the U.S. military, the U.S. Army and Air Force and Marine and Navy, they do a very good job. We do a good job on instilling in our soldiers both ethics and principles that we are fighting for. Why they want to know, and their families want to know why they are fighting, why they're being sent to Poland to defend against the possibility that the Russians will further invade. That the Russians may, when they're moving their tanks west into Ukraine and coming toward Poland, why are those soldiers there? They're there to defend. Yes, they're there to defend Poland. They're to defend NATO. Yes, they're to defend the United States that has a lot at stake in Europe. But they are also there to defend principles and in some real sense, freedom. I mean, this is a conflict, Matt, as you well know, and our soldiers know. This is a conflict against it's against evil. I mean, we're talking about war criminals who are evil, there some wars. I fought in one. I fought in Vietnam. There's less clear who the enemy was in Vietnam. You couldn't tell. It's very clear in Ukraine. It's very clear in Europe. We know why we're there. We know that this is a fight against evil people who want to do bad things, who have for no reason invaded a smaller country for no reason, and they could do it again. And so our soldiers, and it's up to the lieutenants that are studying with you, Matt, it's up to the military chain of command to include that kind of conversation, because those soldiers, the individual soldiers, will want to know, their families will want to know. And that's why it's so important that the United States of America, that all of our citizens know and support what we're doing. That's why it's so important that it struck me this morning driving in to work on every overpass over I-66 that I was driving toward Washington. Every overpass had two flags. One is the same flag that Yuri has behind him, and the other was the American flag. And on every one, there was the Ukrainian flag and the American flags flying side by side, draped side by side over these overpass. And that's important for the American people to understand. American people down to and including the soldiers who are defending them.
Excellent. Well, that just underscores the importance of what you're doing with us today. And we really thank you for your time. If you might indulge me with just one last question.
Sure.
There's been obviously concerns about time frame of this war. And I don't, I would confess for myself, it's very difficult to predict what it will be, although I share your optimism about the commitment of the Ukrainian people, and Ukrainian soldiers have certainly surprised a lot of military analysts. So I guess I would really turn to a question about Russia itself. One audience member asked the quite astute question: is there a way for Putin to get out of this that is in any way face-saving? So is there an exit strategy for Putin that would preserve some aspect of what he wanted to achieve, or allow him to claim some sort of success, but leave Ukraine largely alone? I guess I don't want to fill in your response all that much, but it's more broadly, I suppose, a question on I think related to this is this concern you raised about the effect on Russia itself and the pressure that Putin most obviously is feeling now and will feel as the war goes on. So what's your analysis of how this ends and how Putin might make a decision to end it, if at all?
So he might not make a decision to end it, and the people of Russia might make that decision for him, or the people in the Kremlin. We know that there's some disagreement within the Kremlin, within the governing circles right around Putin. Some real questions about whether this is a good idea. A lot of people think it's not. So there might be one outcome might be that either the people of Russia go to the streets in their millions, or there's a palace coup, not unheard of in Soviet times, in Russian times. That's one outcome. Can't count on that. That's up to the Russian people. On the business about saving face, on the one hand, he's boxed himself in. This is the result. There's one man responsible for all of this, and it's Vladimir Putin. And I'm less concerned about saving his face than I am about looking for ways that both sides, both the Russian side and the NATO side and the Ukrainian side, can achieve some measure of security. As President Putin has indicated, he says he's got some legitimate concerns about whether or not NATO is about to put missiles in Ukraine that could strike him we could be in Moscow within 7 minutes. There's a deal to be struck there. We would be willing to commit not to put missiles in Ukraine that could strike Moscow in 7 minutes if the Russians agree to take missiles out of European Russia that can strike European capitals in 7 minutes. In other words, there's a deal for that. There's a deal for confidence building measures on conventional forces, so that neither side can build up forces that might look like an invasion. And both sides know that those are just exercises, or both sides know that they can go look and observe what those buildups are for. In other words, build confidence, reduce risk. There are things that can be agreed, negotiated, that President Putin could say he got something for. I don't think that the Ukrainian people will agree to give him part of their country because he invaded. I think they will fight, and I think in the end, as I've said before, and I'll say it again, in the end, they will push him out. They will push him out. That may be a long battle. They had a long battle in Afghanistan. and the Ukrainians are much better, stronger, more coherent than the Afghans. It'll be a long battle. Many Russian soldiers will die. Many Ukrainians will die. Russians will try to suppress Ukrainians, but they, in the end, will push them out. And yep, Putin will have lost face.
All right, I think we'll end on that note. Yuri, would you like to say a final thank you? Perhaps Yuri did most of the work getting you here, and so I feel obliged, in fact, indebted to the student community at Michigan State University and to the Michigan State University Ukrainian Student Organization. So I'll let Yuri say the final goodbye, perhaps.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Pauly. Yeah, I just want to say again, thank you very much, Ambassador Taylor, for taking the time out of your schedule. As of now, is getting increasingly more and more busier as tensions build up in Ukraine and the conflict, this ever-evolving conflict changes day by day. So thank you very much again for coming to speak to us, our student body, and all others who came to view your presentation and the questions that you answered for us. And then I'd also like to thank all of our viewers and all participants who came here to show your support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people.
Yuri, let me just let me echo Matt's thanks to you for organizing this, and echo your thanks to all the people who participated. Great questions. Ukraine deserves our support. You're showing that support. You know how to do this, and this in the end, Ukraine will prevail.
Thank you very much. I think that concludes our webinar. I hope everyone has a good rest of their day. And then just continue looking up the current events in Ukraine. And you can find Mr. Taylor or Ambassador Taylor on the news quite often. And I'm sure he'll be popping up, giving more information at multiple events in the future.